Welcome to this tutorial video. This video introduces the domain General Economic and Social Development of the Indigenous Navigators Climate Change module. In this video, we introduce the concepts covered in this domain and the relevant human rights instruments. This domain assesses the enjoyment of several economic, social, and cultural rights, which are also reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. The following rights are addressed: the right to food, the right to development, the right to social protection, and the right to housing and water and sanitation. The enjoyment of these rights is crucial for the survival of Indigenous peoples and their flourishing as distinct peoples. This domain therefore reflects on the degree to which these rights are met in ways that enable the physical and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples and their sustainability as peoples. In the context of climate change, the recognition of these rights is critical for ensuring states are aware of and protect the economic, social, and cultural rights of Indigenous peoples in developing and implementing climate change-related measures and activities, and ensuring measures are put in place to prevent and mitigate the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples' economic, social, and cultural rights. UNDRIP Article 21 outlines the rights of Indigenous peoples to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, highlighting the need for effective and special measures to address the historic discrimination that they have faced. UNDRIP articles related to economic, social, and cultural rights are underpinned by a range of binding human rights obligations. For example, in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or ICESCA, and further interpreted by its treaty body, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or CESCA. The first issue covered under this domain relates to the right to food. The surveys look at how climate change can impact the availability and accessibility of foods. This includes foods that make up the traditional diet of Indigenous communities. For example, climate change can lead to decreasing crop yield of traditional food. Rising sea temperatures and acidification due to climate change can also affect fish stocks and the traditional occupation of Indigenous peoples. The rights of Indigenous communities to economic, social, and cultural rights can be found in Articles 21 and 22 of UNDRIP. Article 21 says, Indigenous peoples have the right, without discrimination, to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including, inter alia, in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. While the right to food is not explicitly mentioned, the use of the term inter alia refers to all economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to food. The right to food is recognized in binding instruments, including Article 11 of ICESCA, which recognizes the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. The CESCA clarified that in practice, this means that the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means of its procurement. The surveys monitor whether national or climate change-related policies consider the impacts of climate change on the right to food of Indigenous peoples, including access to and quality of their traditional food, and if Indigenous communities have experienced harms or violations of their right to adequate food. The second category addresses the right of Indigenous peoples to the continuous improvement of their economic and social conditions, and the state's obligations to support this. In the context of climate change adaptation and development planning, states must consider the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples and continue to respect Indigenous peoples' rights to traditional and other economic measures as a means of work. The right to development is also addressed in Article 21 of UNDRIP. The state has an obligation to progressively realize economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to health, adequate standard of living, or social security, as reflected in ISESCA. In the context of climate change-related policies and activities, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, says that states have to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere in a way that allows for economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. This includes the development undertaken by Indigenous peoples. Article 20 of UNDRIP outlines that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions, to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. This is underpinned by binding instruments, including on cultural rights and the right to work, to free choice of employment, and the right to enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work. The National Survey assesses whether the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities is considered in any national development plan or program, and if resources have been appropriately allocated. Whether Indigenous peoples experience poverty, this aligns with Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 121, and whether national legislation recognises the rights of Indigenous peoples to engage freely in their traditional and other economic activities. The Community Survey then assesses whether any financial resources had been received by Indigenous communities to address climate change risks and impacts, whether Indigenous peoples have suffered deprivation of means due to climate change impacts or related measures, and then whether the right to redress has been met in any of these instances. This category looks at social security programs and the degree to which states develop social security programs that take climate risk into account. The right to social security is recognized in Article 21 of UNDRIP. It is also set out in binding human rights treaties, including ISESCA, which says that states must recognize the right of everyone to social security, including social insurance. Social security programs need to be adequate in view of climate change risks and impacts, in particular for Indigenous peoples at increased risk of experiencing climate change impacts. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in General Comment 26 said that social security programs should provide protection against environmental shocks and slow onset harms such as climate change. The National Survey assesses whether existing social security programs consider climate risk, and then specifically climate risk to Indigenous peoples. The Community Survey assesses whether Indigenous communities have been able to access social protection programs and whether the support is adequate in the context of climate change impacts. This category covers three core economic, social, and cultural rights: the rights to adequate housing, water, and sanitation in the context of climate change impacts and related measures. Climate change can impact the right to water in different ways. For example, increased drought conditions can lead to water scarcity, or acidification can impact water quality. The right to water is also referred to in Article 21 of UNDRIP, and underpinned by binding human rights obligations under Article 11 of ISESCA. This is further elaborated on in relation to Indigenous peoples in SESCA General Comment 15, which says Indigenous peoples' access to water resources on their ancestral lands is protected from encroachment and unlawful pollution. States should provide resources for Indigenous peoples to design, deliver, and control their access to water. The National Survey assesses whether national policies specifically address the foreseeable climate-related impacts to Indigenous peoples' rights to water. The community survey then tests the degree to which states are taking action to address these foreseeable harms due to climate change-related impacts or measures. Related to the right to housing is Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources that they have traditionally occupied. This is regardless of whether the state has recognized this through title deed or binding agreements. However, in many cases, the existence of a title deed or binding agreement in the recognition of land and resource rights is a good indicator of the security of tenure. Recognition of the right to housing and security of tenure is important in the context of climate change impacts and climate change-related projects or measures. Climate change-related measures or projects typically require large amounts of land and resources, for example, for energy production or carbon sequestration. This could affect the land and natural resource rights of Indigenous peoples. Climate change-induced disasters can result in destruction of land or relocation of Indigenous peoples. Recognition and documentation of land and resource rights is important to ensure land can be reclaimed or compensated for. SESCA General Comment 4 clarifies that the security of tenure is a core aspect of the binding right to adequate housing in ISESCA Article 11. The Community Survey monitors tenure rights to land and resources. This issue aligns with Sustainable Development Goal or SDG Indicator 142, which looks at the proportion of the adult population with secure tenure rights to land. These questions are therefore aligned with the data collection methodology of this indicator.